What if the very thing some people think protects them is actually holding everyone back? Think about it. Could racial division be acting like a hidden brake on our economy for all of us?
It's a provocative question, and it's central to the book we're looking at today.
Right. We're exploring this really powerful argument, how racism, subtly and not so subtly, impacts everyone's economic well-being, not just certain groups.
Yeah, the consequences ripple outwards in ways people might not expect.
And before we jump right in, if you enjoyed digging deeper into these kinds of ideas, definitely check out Mindful Moments over on our YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
It's where we use AI to analyze books, kind of like this one, breaking down key concepts. It's really designed to spark more reflection and critical thinking. Worth a look.
Sounds interesting. So this book, it kicks off with a core concept, right?
It does. This idea of the zero-sum hierarchy. What exactly is that?
Well, it's the notion that society is structured like a ladder. And crucially, that for one group to climb up, another group must go down.
Okay, like there's a fixed amount of success or well-being to go around.
Exactly. And specifically in the American context, the book argues this is often framed racially. The underlying story is that progress for people of color somehow means a loss for white people.
So it breeds this fear, a fear that equality or racial justice is actually a threat.
Precisely. A fear that a future without racism would somehow leave them worse off.
But the book pushes back on that. It says not everyone sees it that way.
Right. Research cited in the book suggests Black Americans, for instance, generally don't subscribe to that zero-sum view. Their sense of progress isn't typically tied to seeing another group decline.
That's a fascinating distinction, and history seems to back that up too, doesn't it? The book talks about the civil rights era.
It does. It points out that many civil rights victories, which were fiercely resisted, often based on that zero-sum fear, actually ended up benefiting the entire South economically. Well, ending segregation, for example, eventually led to stronger regional economies, more investment, better infrastructure, things that lifted prospects for everyone, white and Black residents alike.
So the very changes people feared would hurt them actually helped build a more prosperous society overall.
In many ways, yes.
Yeah.
It challenges that core zero-sum assumption.
To really get this, we probably need to go back further historically. The book digs into the origins of this division.
It really does. It argues that the concept of American freedom itself was, from the start, defined partly in opposition to the enslavement of Africans.
How did that work in the early colonies? Weren't there European servants too?
Absolutely. In early colonial times, you had a large serving class made up of both Europeans, often indentured, and Africans facing brutal conditions. There wasn't initially this rigid, color-based line we see later.
So what changed?
Fear. Specifically, the fear of solidarity. The book highlights events like Bacon's Rebellion.
Yes. Where indentured servants, black and white, rose up together.
Exactly. That terrified the colonial elite. The possibility of a united lower class crossing racial lines was a major threat to their power.
So they acted deliberately to prevent that.
That's the argument. They began instituting laws to specifically separate the servant class based on skin color, granting some privileges to poor whites to create a buffer and discourage alliances with Black people.
Wow. So this racial divide wasn't just organic, it was constructed. A strategy.
A strategy of control, yes. And this is where freedom increasingly became tied to the idea of whiteness.
The book mentions a specific law.
The 1790 Naturalization Act. It explicitly limited citizenship to free white persons. That's a foundational moment, legally encoding racial exclusion into who could even be considered fully American.
And the Constitution itself, it wasn't neutral on this, was it?
Far from it. The book points to the pro-slavery elements embedded within it, like the Three-Fifths Compromise.
Right, which gave slave states extra political power based on counting enslaved people while denying their humanity.
It linked political power directly to the institution of slavery and, by extension, to whiteness, reinforcing that hierarchy.
Okay, so that sets the historical stage. But the book argues this zero-sum story, this racial division, is still very much alive.
Oh, absolutely. The argument is that it's actively politically weaponized today.
How does that work?
By stoking white resentment towards other groups, often immigrants or people of color, it serves as a potent distraction.
A distraction from what?
From things like the massive upward redistribution of wealth that's been happening over the last few decades. If people are focused on perceived racial threats, they're less likely to notice who is really benefiting economically.
So even during times that seemed like progress, like the Obama presidency.
Even then, the book talks about racial priming, how political elites could subtly use race to trigger anxieties and undermine support for policies that might actually benefit a broad range of people, including many white working-class voters, things like healthcare reform.
Divide and conquer, essentially. Keep the focus on race, not on shared economic struggles.
That's the core argument, and it has tangible costs.
Let's talk about those costs. The book links this to public goods, infrastructure. Why America seems maybe stingy compared to other wealthy nations.
Yeah, I'd ask that question. Why the underinvestment in things that benefit everyone? Part of the answer, it suggests, lies in that history of inequality.
How so?
Well, particularly in the former Confederate states. The legacy of slavery created institutions designed to limit opportunity. After the Civil War, these states lagged way behind in developing public education, roads, healthcare.
And that affected everyone living there, not just Black communities.
Right. It created barriers to economic mobility for poor white families, too. A legacy that the book argues persists even today in some regions.
Yeah.
Less opportunity overall.
It wasn't just the South, though, right? Federal policies, too?
No, it was broader. Think about the creation of the suburbs after World War II, heavily subsidized by federal programs.
The GI Bill, FHA loans.
Right.
Things that built the white middle class.
Exactly. But the book details how these programs often included explicitly racially discriminatory practices, redlining, restrictive covenants that locked Black families out of that wealth-building opportunity.
So a universal benefit wasn't truly universal.
Correct. And even something like Social Security initially excluded domestic and agricultural workers' fields where Black workers were heavily concentrated. These exclusions weakened the programs overall and, perhaps ironically, sowed seeds of resentment later on.
Okay, let's shift to education. The book talks about college costs.
A huge issue. It traces the shift away from public funding for higher education towards a system heavily reliant on tuition.
The debt for diploma system, as it calls it.
Right. And while this affects many students, it disproportionately burdens Black students because of the massive, historically generated racial wealth gap. They simply have fewer family resources to draw on.
And the resistance to making college more affordable, or even free again.
The book points out a fascinating dynamic. Some of the strongest resistance comes from older, white, college-educated voters, who themselves often benefited from much more affordable, publicly subsidized higher education decades ago.
That zero-sum thinking again. I got mine pulling up the ladder.
It certainly looks like that through the lens the book provides. A fear that expanding opportunity now somehow diminishes their past advantages.
And the student debt crisis isn't just an individual problem, is it?
Not at all. It has huge macroeconomic effects. People delay buying homes, starting families, saving for retirement. It's a drag on the entire economy.
Okay, another area. Healthcare.
Yeah.
You mentioned racial priming earlier. The book discusses Medicaid expansion.
Yes, this is a really stark example. After the Affordable Care Act, states had the option to expand Medicaid, largely funded by the federal government, to cover more low-income adults.
Which would include many low-income white people, especially in states that didn't expand.
Exactly. Yet several states refused the expansion. The book argues this opposition was heavily fueled by racialized rhetoric, associating Medicaid with undeserving minorities, even though rejecting it demonstrably harmed the health and financial stability of their own white working-class constituents.
So the political messaging, the sort of dog whistle about race, overrode the clear economic and health benefits for their own population.
That's the analysis presented. The term Medicaid expansion itself became politically toxic in some areas, preventing a rational debate about the actual impacts. It hurts public health overall.
Let's turn to housing, specifically the 2008 crisis.
A major focus. The book details how predatory lending practices, subprime mortgages with exploding rates, disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities, often exploiting decades of housing segregation.
That's where the crisis started, or was most concentrated initially.
Yes, but crucially, the book emphasizes that when the House of Cards collapsed, the foreclosure crisis swept through all communities. Millions of white families lost their homes, too.
So allowing that predatory behavior in one segment of the market eventually poisoned the whole system.
Absolutely. Deregulation and lax enforcement allowed it to fester, often justified by racial stereotypes about financial responsibility, until the damage was too widespread to ignore.
It also mentions something about who was seen as the culprit.
Yeah, it highlights a kind of cognitive dissonance. Even when the architects of the crisis, the ones packaging and selling these toxic loans, were overwhelmingly wealthy, often white, figures on Wall Street, There was still a struggle for some regulators and the public to not somehow blame the victims, particularly the borrowers of color.
That's disturbing, but the book doesn't just focus on the problems, right? It talks about solutions, about solidarity.
Definitely. It looks back at historical examples like the Knights of Labor in the late 19th century.
What did they do?
They were one of the early large unions that actively tried to organize across racial lines. They understood that employers could pit white workers against black workers to keep wages down for everyone. Solidarity was strength.
So divide and conquer versus unite and win.
Essentially, yes, though achieving that unity has always been a struggle. The book contrasts that with more recent examples, like votes against unionizing in some southern auto plants, where racial divisions were arguably exploited to defeat the union drive.
But then there are more hopeful contemporary examples.
Yes, like the Fight for $15 movement. This is presented as a prime example of what the book calls the solidarity dividend.
The solidarity dividend.
Yeah, the idea that when diverse groups recognize their shared economic interests and organize together, the dividends are substantial and widespread.
And the Fight for $15 achieved that.
Largely, yes. By building a broad coalition of low-wage workers, fast food workers, home care workers, etc., across racial lines, they achieved significant minimum wage increases in many cities and states, benefiting millions of workers of all backgrounds.
So overcoming those divisions led to concrete economic gains for everyone involved.
That's the key takeaway. Shared interest trumping racial division.
The book also tackles the political system itself, how it's structured.
Right. It argues that the long history of suppressing black political participation hasn't just harmed black communities, it's also often limited the political choices and influence of poorer white Americans.
How does that work? Voter suppression tactics, for instance.
Exactly. Things like strict photo ID laws, closing polling places, or DMV offices, particularly in minority neighborhoods. These tactics are often presented as race-neutral, aimed at preventing fraud.
But the impact isn't neutral.
No. They disproportionately disenfranchise voters of color who are less likely to have the required IDs or easy access to get them. But they also hit low-income white voters, students, the elderly, anyone who might face similar barriers. The net effect is often to shrink the electorate in ways that favor certain political outcomes.
And campaign finance, big money in politics.
Another area. While the influence of wealthy donors and corporate PACs arguably harms communities of color most directly by skewing policy priorities, it also drowns out the voices and concerns of average, non-wealthy white citizens. Their issues get less attention, too.
So reforms like public financing of elections, which the book touches on,
are presented as ways to potentially create a more level playing field, a more representative democracy where it's not just about who has the deepest pockets.
It really hammers home this idea of linked fate, doesn't it? Revisiting W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah, that powerful observation Du Bois made about workers, white and black, with virtually identical economic interests, yet divided by racial hatred and fear, ultimately harming themselves.
There's an anecdote in the book about that, right? A young white girl.
Yes. A striking story about a girl growing up in deep poverty who, when reminded of the racial hierarchy, felt suddenly not poor anymore, just by contrasting her situation with black people. It shows the psychological wage, as Du Bois called it, how racism can offer a false sense of status that masks shared economic vulnerability.
It's a really damaging substitute for actual economic security.
Deeply damaging.
Yeah.
For everyone involved.
So bringing it all together, what's the path forward according to the book? How do we get past this zero-sum trap?
Well, the first step, the book argues, is crucial. Recognizing that racism isn't just a problem for people of color. It's a drag on everyone. It undermines our collective potential.
Seeing it as a shared problem, not an us versus them issue.
Exactly. And then building on that recognition through cross-racial solidarity, learning from examples like the Fight for $15, community organizing, efforts focused on truth and reconciliation.
Like the TRHT initiatives mentioned, truth, racial healing, and transformation.
Yes, initiatives aimed at honestly confronting the history and present reality of racism and working towards structural change.
The book also suggests huge economic potential in closing these gaps.
Immense potential. Studies cited suggest closing the racial wealth gap could add trillions to the U.S. economy over time. So racial equity isn't just morally right, it's economically smart for the entire nation. Collective prosperity is tied to racial justice.
So it means actively countering those divisive narratives.
Absolutely. Challenging the idea that we're locked in a zero-sum game, building connections based on shared values, shared economic goals rather than on skin color.
And reinvesting in public goods.
Yes, refilling the well of public goods education, healthcare, infrastructure, effective government services that benefit everybody. Moving away from the scarcity mindset fostered by division.
This framework, the one the book offers, it really reframes how we might think about progress and who benefits.
It really does. It suggests the burdens of racism are like weights holding back the entire society, not just one part of it.
It's a powerful lens. We really encourage you, our listeners, to keep thinking about these connections. How might these dynamics be playing out where you live in your community?
Yeah, it prompts a lot of reflection.
And remember, for more analysis like this, check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel. And of course, explore our podcasts for other conversations exploring important ideas.
Good resources to keep the thinking going.
Definitely. If you found this exploration valuable today, please do subscribe and maybe share it with someone else who might find it interesting.
And consider getting the book itself, links in the show notes. Reading it directly offers so much more depth.
Absolutely. Most importantly, though, keep questioning the narratives you hear. Keep thinking critically about how our society works and how we can build a truly more equitable future for everyone.